welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this fourth Sunday in Advent, when our Gospel reading is written in the first chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew, verses 18 through 25. The anointed Jesus' birth happened in this way. When his mother, Mary, was promised in marriage to Joseph, before they came together, she was found to be pregnant by divine action. Her husband, Joseph, who was decent and did not wish to disgrace her, considered releasing her from the marriage privately. But as he pondered what to do, look, the Lord's messenger appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary, your wife, because what is conceived in her is from divine action. She will bear a son, and you will name him Jesus, since he will save his people from their sins." All this happened in order to accord with what was said by the Lord through the prophet, who said, "Look, the young woman will become pregnant and bear a son, and they will name him Emmanuel," which is translated, God with us. Joseph was raised from sleep and did as the Lord's messenger directed him. He took his wife and did not know her until she bore a son, and he named him Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. 8 short verses here, and as Christians understand history, the whole turning point of history and God's leading us through it. 8 short verses. And the great biblical scholar Raymond Brown, 45 years ago, in his book, The Birth of the Messiah, could write 43 pages about these 8 verses, and it could have been more, except that he had already said some of what needed saying in the pages before he got to verse 18 in chapter 1. There is so much here. There is so much richness, so much tradition, and frankly, so many questions. Right now, I'd like us to look at just 3 things. And all 3 of them are about what Matthew wants us to understand that Jesus is. First of all, who's the central character in this story? In many ways, it's Joseph, who is identified as a son of David. That means that if his son, Joseph's son, is anointed for a divine task, he will be the Messiah. Joseph is the connection between Jesus as the church's Messiah and King David, whose royal line defines who the Messiahs will be. The ones who carry God's mantle of leadership and authority and power in order to lead God's people as they should be led. And Joseph, Matthew wants us to be sure we understand, is a worthy figure to be the one from whom this Messiah comes. He is righteous, Matthew says. He depicts him as thoughtful. When he finds himself in an awkward situation, he gives consideration to these things. And he is responsive. When a messenger from God explains the situation to him and tells him what to do, Joseph does just that. Righteous, thoughtful, and responsive. This son of David is the kind of figure you want in the pedigree of the Messiah. And then there's this Holy Spirit of whom the messenger speaks. This is not yet in the Gospel of Matthew the Holy Spirit of later Christian theology about a Trinitarian God. This is the power of God present in the world, hence the translation that the one conceived in her is of divine action. And that doesn't mean that the Holy Spirit named here is the male half of Mary's process of conception. This doesn't even suggest, as it has later been taken, that Mary's was a virgin birth of Jesus, let alone perpetually virgin. Those are articles of faith that develop later. But for Matthew, to say that what is in her is it literally what she has in her is of a Holy Spirit, is of divine action, means don't look for the sexual procreation here. Don't ask about the biology of this. This is divine creativity at work. And what comes from this will be an agent of the divine, will be sent by God into the world for a purpose. And then the name that is given. The messenger from God says to Joseph, "You will name him Jesus, because he will save his people from their sins." That builds on some wordplay in the Hebrew, actually a kind of folk wordplay in the Hebrew. But again, it indicates that there is a purpose here beyond what would have traditionally been understood as the Messiah's role in contemporary Judaism. The gospel writer, and certainly the church later on, transformed that understanding of Messiah based on what they knew about Jesus. Because beyond being an anointed one who would rescue Israel from exile or from occupation and reestablish a kingdom autonomous and sovereign for the Jewish people, the church comes to believe that in Jesus, people are saved from their sins, saved from the power of sin which leads to death. And so his name is Jesus, because he will save us. And in all of this, Matthew says, what we find is the embodiment of what the prophet, in this case the prophet Isaiah, had promised as God's presence with God's people in the world. This whole act, not just Jesus as an individual, not just the birth as a birth, but this whole scenario embodies what Isaiah had promised, fills it out with particular meaning, fills it more fully in some ways than it has been filled before. You know, as a father, as a parent, I have certain explicit and implicit promises that I've made to my children. And every time that I live up to those promises, I fulfill those promises, not as though I never have before, but each time I embody what that promise suggests. I fill out that promise in the particular moment. I fill it more fully than it has been filled before, because here it is again. And that promise comes to reality between me and my children. And that's just a human example. But Isaiah says, this is what God has said, that God is with us. God was with God's people in the 8th century with Isaiah and the king and that young woman over there who is pregnant. God is with us, with Joseph and Mary in their time in the first century. God is with us again and again. And today, as we on this fourth Sunday in Advent anticipate celebrating once again the coming of a child whose arrival reassures us that ever and again, just as promised, God is with us. And so we also call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. God bless.